The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered boardwalk of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, as Sarah McKinnon wiped the dust from her hands on her worn cotton apron. At 23, she had inherited more than just her father's general store. She'd inherited his stubborn pride and his belief that every stranger deserved a measure of respect. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the golden light that painted the dusty main street. Murphy's saloon sat directly across from her store, its batwing doors constantly swinging with the comings and goings of cowboys, drifters, and traveling merchants. Sarah had grown accustomed to the steady hum of voices, the occasional burst of laughter, and the tinkling of piano keys that drifted across the street. Today, however, something felt different in the air, a tension that made her skin prickle with unease. She'd noticed the stranger earlier that morning when he'd ridden into town on a magnificent black stallion, his spurs jingling with each measured step. Unlike the usual travelers who passed through Bitter Creek, this man carried himself with a deadly grace that made even the local toughs give him a wide berth. His black hat was pulled low over his eyes, and twin Colt 45s hung from his gun belt with the worn ease of frequent use. "That's Jake Morrison," old Pete Wilson had whispered to her when she'd inquired about the newcomer. "They call him Deadeye. Heard tell he's killed more men than the cholera outbreak of '69. Sarah had dismissed Pete's words as the usual frontier gossip, but now, watching the way people unconsciously stepped aside when the stranger moved, she wondered if there might be more truth to the tales than she'd wanted to believe. The merchant she'd been expecting, Thomas Hartwell from Denver, had finally arrived on the afternoon stage, looking road-weary but grateful for the relative civilization of Bitter Creek. He'd conducted his business with quiet efficiency, purchasing supplies for his continued journey west, and Sarah had found herself genuinely appreciating his courteous manner and fair dealing. As was her custom with traveling merchants who treated her with respect, Sarah decided to send him a glass of whiskey at Murphy's as a gesture of goodwill. It was a small tradition her father had started, and she'd maintained it as a way of building relationships that often led to repeat business. She pressed a silver dollar into young Tommy Fletcher's palm, the 10-year-old son of the local blacksmith who often ran errands for a few coins. "Tommy, I need you to take this to Murphy and tell him to pour a glass of his best whiskey for the gentleman in the brown coat who came in on today's stage. Tell him it's from Sarah McKinnon, with thanks for his business." Tommy's freckled face lit up with the importance of his mission. "Yes, ma'am, Miss Sarah. The gentleman in the brown coat, best whiskey, from Sarah McKinnon." Sarah watched as the boy scampered across the street, dodging a freight wagon loaded with supplies for the mining camps up in the hills. She turned back to her ledger, satisfied that she'd maintained the courtesy that had made her father's store a respected establishment in this rough frontier town. Inside Murphy's saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the mingled scents of whiskey, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. The usual crowd had gathered for their evening drinks, ranch hands celebrating the end of another brutal day, a few miners down from the claims, and the handful of permanent residents who made the saloon their second home. Tommy Fletcher burst through the batwing doors with all the energy of youth, his eyes scanning the crowded room for the gentleman in the brown coat. In the dim light filtered through grimy windows, the boy's young eyes made a crucial mistake. Both Thomas Hartwell and Jake Morrison sat at tables near the bar, and both wore dark coats that looked nearly identical in the saloon's shadowy interior. "Mr. Murphy," Tommy called out to the burly bartender, "Miss Sarah McKinnon says to give the gentleman in the brown coat your best whiskey, with thanks for his business." Murphy nodded, reaching for his finest bottle, a rare Kentucky bourbon that he reserved for special occasions. Without questioning which gentleman the boy meant, and assuming it was the obvious choice of the well-known gunslinger who commanded respect through fear, Murphy poured the amber liquid into his best glass and personally carried it to Jake Morrison's table. Jake looked up from cleaning his fingernails with a wickedly sharp knife, his pale grey eyes fixing on the bartender with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. Those eyes had seen death and dealt it out in equal measure, and they held no warmth or mercy. "Compliments of Miss Sarah McKinnon," Murphy said, setting the glass down with a slight tremor in his hand. "She thanks you for your business." The saloon gradually fell silent as word spread through the room. Every man present knew that Jake Morrison hadn't conducted any business with Sarah McKinnon, or any business at all in Bitter Creek for that matter. The gunslinger's reputation preceded him like the shadow of death itself, and everyone knew he was just passing through, probably running from some bloody encounter in another town. Jake's hand moved slowly toward his gun, the leather of his holster creaking in the sudden stillness. His eyes never left the glass of whiskey as he contemplated this unexpected development. In his world, every gesture carried meaning, and unsolicited drinks from unknown parties usually meant trouble of the deadliest kind. The piano player's fingers froze above the keys. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the flies seemed to buzz more quietly in the oppressive atmosphere that had suddenly descended upon the saloon. Jake Morrison slowly stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound that seemed to echo like thunder in the silent room. His right hand hovered inches from his gun grip, and every man in the saloon held his breath, knowing that death might be only seconds away. Without warning, Jake drew his Colt with lightning speed and fired a single shot into the ceiling. The explosion of gunpowder was deafening in the confined space, and splinters of wood rained down on the terrified patrons. The message was clear as the smoking hole above their heads. The next bullet might not be aimed so high. "Nobody," Jake said in a voice as cold as a mountain winter, "sends Jake Morrison a drink without expecting something in return, and I always collect my debts." The silence that followed was more terrifying than the gunshot itself. The sound of the gunshot echoed across Bitter Creek like a death knell, causing Sarah to drop her pencil and look up sharply from her ledger. The familiar sounds of the saloon, laughter, conversation, the tinkling piano, had been replaced by an ominous silence that made her stomach clench with dread. Through her store window, she could see people hurrying away from Murphy's saloon, their faces pale with fear. Mrs. Henderson clutched her young daughter's hand as they practically ran toward the church at the end of the street. Even the usually fearless ranch hands were giving the saloon a wide berth, their boots kicking up dust clouds in their haste to distance themselves from whatever had happened inside. Sarah's heart began to race as she realized that her simple gesture of courtesy might have somehow gone terribly wrong. She moved to the window, pressing her face against the cool glass, trying to see inside the saloon's dim interior. The batwing doors suddenly burst open, and Jake Morrison stepped onto the boardwalk with the measured stride of a man who owned whatever ground his boots touched. His pale eyes swept the street with predatory intensity, and when they fixed on Sarah's store, she felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. He crossed the street with deliberate slowness, his spurs ringing against the wooden boards like the tolling of church bells. Each step seemed to echo with menace, and Sarah found herself backing away from the window, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her father's old desk. The bell above her door chimed with an almost musical innocence as Jake entered, but the sound now carried an undertone of doom that made Sarah's skin crawl. He stood just inside the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the relative dimness of the store, while his presence seemed to fill the entire space with danger. "Miss Sarah McKinnon, I presume," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl of Texas but with an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "I believe we need to have ourselves a conversation." Sarah straightened her spine, calling upon every ounce of courage her father had instilled in her during their years together on the frontier. "Mr. Morrison, if I've somehow offended you, I assure you it was unintentional. I sent that whiskey to thank a traveling merchant for his business, not to—" "Not to what?" Jake interrupted, his hand resting casually on his gun grip. "Not to insult a man who's killed for lesser provocations. Not to make a mockery of Deadeye Morrison in front of a saloon full of witnesses." The truth of the situation began to dawn on Sarah with the slow horror of a nightmare becoming reality. Young Tommy had delivered her message to the wrong man, not to the polite merchant Thomas Hartwell, but to this dangerous gunslinger who interpreted every gesture as either a challenge or a threat. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The boy who delivered the message must have pointed you out by error. I meant no disrespect, Mr. Morrison. I was simply showing appreciation to a customer." Jake studied her with those cold grey eyes, taking in every detail of her appearance, the way her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, the determination in her brown eyes despite her obvious fear, the worn but clean dress that spoke of frontier practicality rather than vanity. She was younger than he'd expected, and there was something in her bearing that reminded him of someone from his past, someone he'd tried very hard to forget. "Mistakes," he said slowly, "have consequences out here, Miss McKinnon. A man's reputation is all that keeps him alive in this country, and when that reputation gets questioned—" He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air inside the store. She could hear her father's voice echoing from memory. "When you're facing a dangerous animal, Sarah, you don't run and you don't show fear. You stand your ground and you speak truth." "Then let me speak truth to you, Mr. Morrison," she said, lifting her chin. "I run an honest business in this town. I treat people with respect regardless of their past, and I expect the same courtesy in return. If you've come here looking for trouble, you'll find I'm not as helpless as I might appear." For a moment, something flickered in Jake's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or even a grudging respect. Most people cowered when they found themselves facing Deadeye Morrison, but this young woman stood her ground like a seasoned gunfighter facing down an opponent. "Helpless," he said, and for the first time, there was something other than menace in his voice. "No, Miss McKinnon, I don't believe you are helpless at all, but you are naive if you think good intentions protect you from the consequences of your actions." He moved deeper into the store, his keen eyes taking inventory of the neat rows of supplies, the carefully organized shelves, the small touches that spoke of someone who took pride in their work. It was the kind of establishment his mother might have run, back in the days before the war changed everything. "You want to make this right?" Jake asked, stopping near a display of ammunition. "Then you're going to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, until I decide your debt is paid." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "What kind of debt are you talking about, Mr. Morrison?" "The kind that gets settled with service, not silver," he replied. "You see, Miss McKinnon, I'm not just passing through Bitter Creek, I'm here on business. The kind of business that requires local knowledge and local connections. The kind your father built up over the years." The mention of her father sent a chill down Sarah's spine. How could this stranger possibly know about her father's network of contacts throughout the territory? Jake saw her reaction and smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, yes. I know all about Samuel McKinnon, honest merchant, pillar of the community, and very quietly, one of the most effective information brokers between Denver and Salt Lake City. A man knew things, Miss McKinnon. And now that he's gone, those things died with him. Unless his daughter learned the family business, as well as she learned how to stock shelves and balance ledgers." Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her feet like quicksand. Her father had always been discreet about certain aspects of his business, but she'd assumed it was simply the natural caution of a man dealing with rough characters on the frontier. The possibility that there had been layers to his operation that she'd never suspected made her question everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. But even as the words left her lips, she remembered the coded telegrams that occasionally arrived, the visitors who came to the back door after hours, the locked drawer in her father's desk that she'd never had the courage to open after his death. "Don't you?" Jake moved closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space. "Then maybe it's time you learned what your daddy really left you, Miss McKinnon, because ready or not, you're about to inherit more than just a general store." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of blood and casting long shadows across a town that suddenly felt far more dangerous than Sarah had ever imagined. The oil lamp flickered as Sarah's trembling hands fumbled with the small brass key she'd found hidden beneath a loose floorboard behind her father's desk. Jake Morrison stood behind her like a shadow, his presence both protective and threatening as she worked to unlock the drawer that had remained sealed since Samuel McKinnon's death 6 months earlier. "Steady now," Jake murmured, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "Your daddy was careful for good reason. Whatever's in there has kept a lot of people alive and got others killed." The lock clicked open with a soft sound that seemed to echo in the quiet store. Sarah pulled the drawer open with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. Inside, she found a collection of items that painted a picture of her father she'd never known existed, coded telegrams tied with black ribbon, detailed maps marked with routes and safe houses, and a leather-bound journal filled with her father's. Careful handwriting. Jake reached past her to lift out a small wooden box, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as he opened it to reveal a collection of railroad bonds and mining certificates. "Your daddy was more than a merchant, Miss McKinnon. He was a lifeline for people trying to disappear, folks running from the law, from bounty hunters, from their past. He helped them find new lives in exchange for information about what was happening across the territory." Sarah picked up one of the telegrams, struggling to decipher the code. But why? Why would he risk everything we had built here? "Because he understood something most people don't," Jake replied, his grey eyes softening slightly as he watched her examine the evidence of her father's secret life. "Sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't as clear as the law makes it seem. Sometimes good people get caught up in bad situations, and sometimes bad people are capable of redemption." She opened her father's journal to a random page and began reading aloud. "JM arrived today via the southern route, wounded but stable. Says he's done with the killing, Wants to start fresh in California. Arranged passage on the morning freight. Payment. Information about the Garrett gang's hideout in Devil's Canyon. Sarah looked up at Jake with sudden understanding. JM, that's you, isn't it? You've been here before? Jake nodded slowly, his expression guarded. 3 years ago, I was running from a bounty hunter named Caleb Ross, and I had a bullet in my shoulder that was going septic. Your father patched me up, hid me for 2 weeks while I healed, then helped me get out of the territory clean. I told him I was done with killing, that I wanted to change. But you didn't change, Sarah said, studying his weathered face. You're still Jake Morrison. You're still Deadeye. No, he said quietly, and for the first time she heard something like pain in his voice. Jake Morrison died in a canyon outside Tucson 6 months ago. The man standing here now is someone different. Someone who came back to pay a debt to the only man who ever believed he could be better than his reputation. Sarah felt the world shifting again as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. 6 months ago, that's when my father died. Your father sent me a telegram 3 days before he passed. Said he needed help with something important, something that could affect everyone he'd helped over the years. By the time I got here, Samuel McKinnon was in the ground and his secret died with him. Jake moved to the window, peering out at the darkening street. But the people who were hunting him, they're still out there, and now they know about you. Sarah's blood ran cold. What people? What are you talking about? Federal marshals, bounty hunters, men with long memories and longer grudges. Your father's network protected a lot of people, Miss McKinnon, but it also made enemies, powerful enemies who want to see everyone connected to Samuel McKinnon's operation buried alongside him. As if summoned by Jake's words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the street outside. Sarah moved to the window beside him and saw 5 riders approaching through the gathering dusk, their badges glinting in the lamplight from the saloon across the street. Federal marshals, Jake confirmed grimly. And unless I miss my guess, that's Marshal Wade Garrett leading them, brother to the gang leader I helped your father put away 3 years ago. Sarah's mind raced as she began to understand the magnitude of what she'd inherited. They think I know where the people my father helped are hiding. Do you? Jake asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. I don't know. Maybe. These maps, these records. She gestured helplessly at the drawer full of secrets. There's too much here to understand quickly. The riders dismounted outside Murphy's saloon, and Sarah could see Marshal Garrett speaking intently to his men, pointing toward her store. They would be coming for her within minutes. Listen to me carefully, Jake said, his voice taking on the hard edge of command. Those men aren't interested in justice. They want revenge. They'll use any excuse to tear this place apart looking for what they think you know, and they won't be gentle about it. Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. What do? I can't fight federal marshals. No, but I can. Jake began gathering the most important-looking documents from the drawer, stuffing them into a leather saddlebag. Your father saved my life once, Miss McKinnon. Now I'm going to save yours, but you have to trust me and do exactly what I say. Why should I trust you? An hour ago you were threatening to kill me over a glass of whiskey. Jake paused in his packing, meeting her eyes with an intensity that seemed to burn right through her defenses. Because right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and men who would see you dead just to tie up loose ends. Your father believed in second chances, Miss McKinnon. Maybe it's time you decided whether you believe in them too. The sound of boots on the boardwalk outside grew louder, and Sarah realized she was out of time for doubt. Whatever Jake Morrison had been in the past, whatever he might become in the future, he was offering her a chance at survival in a world that had suddenly become far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steady despite her fear. Jake's smile was grim but genuine. Help me finish what your father started, and try not to get us both killed in the process. The front door of the store rattled as someone tested the handle, and Sarah knew that her old life, the safe, predictable life of a frontier merchant, had just ended forever. Back door, Jake whispered urgently, shouldering the saddlebag containing her father's secrets. Move quiet and stay low. Sarah grabbed her father's Winchester rifle from behind the counter and followed Jake through the narrow corridor that led to the store's rear exit. Her heart hammered against her ribs as heavy footsteps approached the front door, accompanied by the metallic rattle of spurs and the creak of leather gun belts. Sarah McKinnon, Marshal Wade Garrett's voice boomed through the wooden door. This is the United States Marshal Service. Open up. We have questions about your father's business dealings. Jake eased the back door open, scanning the alley behind the store for any signs of the marshal's men. The narrow space between buildings was cloaked in shadow, filled with the usual frontier debris, empty crates, discarded barrels, and the skeletal remains of an old freight wagon. More importantly, it was empty of federal lawmen. "They're giving us the front door courtesy," Jake murmured. "It won't last long once they realize we're not answering." The sound of splintering wood echoed from the front of the store as the marshals decided diplomacy had run its course. Sarah winced at the destruction of her father's careful craftsmanship, but there was no time for sentiment now. Jake led her through the maze of back alleys that connected the buildings of Bitter Creek, moving with the silent grace of a man who'd spent years avoiding capture. They emerged behind the livery stable just as shouts erupted from the direction of her store, followed by the crash of merchandise being scattered across the floor. "They're tearing it apart," Sarah whispered, pain evident in her voice. "Your father would understand," Jake replied, checking the loads in both his Colts. He knew this day might come. Old Henrik, the stable master, was nowhere to be seen, probably cowering in his quarters until the federal storm passed over. Jake quickly saddled his black stallion, while Sarah grabbed her father's sturdy bay mare, a reliable horse that had carried Samuel McKinnon on countless journeys across the territory. As they prepared to ride out, Jake suddenly grabbed Sarah's arm. "Before we go any further, you need to understand something. Once we leave this town, there's no going back to your old life. Marshal Garrett won't stop hunting us until he's dead or we are. Are you certain you want to do this?" Sarah looked back toward her store, where lamplight now flickered behind broken windows and angry voices carried on the night air. Everything she'd known, everything her father had built, was being systematically destroyed by men who saw her as nothing more than a loose end to be eliminated. "My father helped people find new lives," she said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "Maybe it's time I found mine." Jake nodded approvingly and swung into his saddle. "Then we ride hard and fast. First stop is Devil's Canyon. There's a way station there that your father used for emergencies." They spurred their horses out of the stable and into the darkness beyond Bitter Creek's glowing windows. Behind them, Sarah could hear Marshal Garrett's furious shouts as his men reported finding the empty store and the evidence of their hasty departure. The Wyoming territory stretched out before them under a canopy of brilliant stars, its vastness both beautiful and terrifying. Sarah had rarely traveled beyond the immediate area around Bitter Creek, and now she found herself racing through unfamiliar country with a man whose reputation was built on violence and death. "Stay close and keep quiet," Jake called over the thunder of hoofbeats. "Sound carries far out here, and Garrett's got men who can track in the dark." They rode hard for the better part of 2 hours, following game trails and creek beds that Jake seemed to know by instinct. The night air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of snow from the high peaks. Sarah's hands grew numb despite her gloves, and her thighs ached from the unaccustomed strain of long-distance riding. Finally, Jake raised his hand, and they slowed to a walk, entering a narrow canyon where the walls rose like black sentinels on either side. The sound of their horses' breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space, and Sarah found herself jumping at every shadow that might conceal an ambush. "Devil's Canyon," Jake announced quietly. "Your father called it the Gates of Second Chances." Halfway through the canyon, Jake dismounted near what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Upon closer inspection, Sarah saw that it was actually a cleverly concealed entrance to a natural cave, just wide enough to accommodate a horse and rider. Inside the cave, Jake lit an oil lamp that had been left hanging on an iron hook, revealing a space that had been converted into a well-supplied way station. There were bedrolls, provisions, medical supplies, and even a small arsenal of weapons. Everything someone might need to disappear completely from their old life. "How many people did my father help through here?" Sarah asked, awed by the extent of the preparations. "Dozens over the years," Jake replied, unsaddling his horse. "Farmers who couldn't pay their debts, women running from violent husbands, men who'd been forced into crimes by circumstances beyond their control. Your father didn't ask too many questions. He just helped them find a way to start over." Sarah began to understand the true scope of her inheritance. Her father hadn't just run a general store, he'd operated an underground railroad for desperate souls seeking redemption, and now that legacy had fallen to her, along with all the dangers that came with it. "There's something else you need to know," Jake said, his expression growing serious in the lamplight. "Your father didn't just help people disappear, he also kept detailed records of everyone who passed through his network. Names, destinations, new identities. That information is worth a fortune to the right buyers, And Marshal Garrett isn't the only one who wants to get his hands on it. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. You mean there are others hunting us? Bounty hunters, private detectives, maybe even Pinkertons. Your father's death created a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. Someone's going to try to fill it, and they'll need those records to do it. The sound of distant horses echoed from the canyon entrance, and both Sarah and Jake froze. Jake quickly extinguished the lamp, plunging them into absolute darkness. "How many?" Sarah whispered. Jake was silent for a long moment, counting the rhythm of hoofbeats. "5 riders moving careful. Garrett found our trail faster than I expected." Sarah's hands tightened on her rifle as she realized their brief respite was over. The chase had found them, and now they were trapped in a canyon with only one way out, directly through their pursuers. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jake's voice carried a familiar edge of danger. "Now, Miss McKinnon, you're going to learn why they call me Dead-Eye Morrison, and you're going to discover just how much of your father's courage you inherited." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Sarah knew that her real education in survival was about to begin. The hoofbeat stopped just outside the hidden entrance to the cave, and Sarah could hear Marshal Garrett's voice echoing off the canyon walls as he directed his men to spread out and search for signs of their quarry. In the absolute darkness of their refuge, every sound seemed magnified. The creak of leather, the jingle of spurs, the nervous snorting of horses sensing tension in their riders. "There's tracks leading into the canyon," one of the deputies reported. "Fresh ones, maybe an hour old." "Then they're trapped," Garrett replied with satisfaction. "This canyon's got only one way in and out. We'll wait for daylight and flush them out like rabbits." Jake leaned close to Sarah, his breath warm against her ear, as he whispered instructions that would determine whether they lived or died. "There's another way out of here, a narrow passage that leads up to the canyon rim. Your father showed it to me 3 years ago, said it was his insurance policy. But it's treacherous in the dark, and we'll have to leave the horses behind." Sarah's heart sank at the thought of abandoning her father's faithful bay mare, but she understood the necessity. "What about the records? The information they're after?" Jake held up the leather saddlebag. "That's why we're not running anymore, Miss McKinnon. It's time to end this, once and for all." He began moving deeper into the cave, and Sarah followed, feeling her way along the rough stone walls. The passage narrowed until they were forced to crawl, the weight of tons of rock pressing down above them. Sarah had never considered herself prone to panic in tight spaces, but the combination of darkness, pursuit, and the unknown dangers ahead tested her courage to its limits. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they emerged onto a narrow ledge high above the canyon floor. The stars provided just enough light to reveal the precarious nature of their position. A slip would mean certain death on the rocks far below. "Can you see them?" Sarah whispered, peering down into the darkness. Jake pointed to several small points of light scattered across the canyon floor. 5 campfires. Garrett's being methodical. He's got men positioned to watch every possible escape route, except this one. They made their way carefully along the ledge until they reached a spot directly above the largest campfire, where Marshal Garrett sat with 2 of his men. From their elevated position, Sarah could hear every word of the conversation below. "Boss, maybe we should just wait them out," one deputy suggested. "They can't stay hidden forever." Garrett spat into the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. "You don't understand what we're dealing with here, Jenkins. That woman has information that could destroy half the federal operations west of the Mississippi. Men I put away, witnesses I relocated, operations that are still running, all of it compromised if those records fall into the wrong hands." "Then why not just make a deal with her?" the other deputy asked. "Offer her protection in exchange for the information." Garrett's laugh was bitter and cold. "Because Sarah McKinnon is already a dead woman walking, just like her father was. You think Samuel McKinnon died of natural causes. I've been hunting that network for 3 years, and I finally found a way to shut it down permanently. The girl just makes it easier. She's young, naive, probably doesn't even understand what she's inherited." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the truth hit her like a physical blow. Her father hadn't died of a heart attack, as Dr. Morrison had claimed. He'd been murdered, and Marshal Garrett was responsible. Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, offering silent support as she struggled to process this devastating revelation. When he spoke, his voice carried the deadly calm that had made his reputation. "Miss McKinnon, I need you to listen very carefully. In about 30 seconds, I'm going to climb down there and settle accounts with Marshal Garrett. When the shooting starts, you take that bag of records, and you ride hard for Denver. Find a man named Thomas Whitmore. He's a federal judge who knew your father and can be trusted. Tell him everything." "No," Sarah whispered fiercely. "I'm not leaving you to face 5 men alone." "This isn't a discussion," Jake replied. "This is me paying my debt to your father." "And what about the debt I owe?" Sarah shot back. "That man killed my father. This is my fight as much as yours." Jake studied her face in the starlight, seeing the same stubborn determination that had made Samuel McKinnon such an effective operator. "Then we do this together, but when I give the signal, you shoot to kill. These men aren't interested in justice. They're here for murder and profit." They made their way to a position where they could see all 5 campfires clearly. Jake had been right about Garrett's tactical deployment. The marshals had positioned themselves to cover every obvious escape route from the canyon floor. What they hadn't anticipated was an attack from above. "Marshal Garrett," Jake called out, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon. "This is Jake Morrison. I believe we have some business to discuss." The effect was immediate and dramatic. All 5 campfires were suddenly extinguished as the marshals scrambled for cover, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Muzzle flashes began to flicker in the darkness as they fired blind shots toward the sound of Jake's voice. "You're supposed to be dead, Morrison," Garrett shouted from behind a boulder. "Heard you got shot to pieces outside Tucson." "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Jake replied, moving to a new position. "But yours are about to become very accurate." Sarah had positioned herself where she could cover the approach to their ledge, and she was grateful for the countless hours her father had spent teaching her to shoot. When one of the deputies tried to scale the canyon wall toward their position, she put a bullet through his shoulder that sent him tumbling back to the rocks below. The gunfight continued for nearly an hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse in the darkness. Gradually, Jake's superior marksmanship began to tell. 2 of the deputies lay still beside their cold campfires, and a third was wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. Finally, Marshal Garrett made a desperate gambit. "McKinnon, I know you can hear me. Your father was a traitor to his country, harboring fugitives and undermining federal authority, but I'm willing to make a deal. Give me those records, and I'll let you disappear. You have my word." Sarah's response rang out clear and strong across the canyon. "Your word means nothing, Marshal. I know what you did to my father." "Then you know what I'm capable of," Garrett replied. "Last chance, girl." Instead of answering, Sarah began to climb down toward the canyon floor. Jake hissed a warning, but she ignored him, driven by a cold fury that demanded personal satisfaction. She moved from shadow to shadow, using every lesson her father had taught her about moving quietly in hostile territory. She found Garrett crouched behind the same boulder where he'd been directing the fight, reloading his rifle with shaking hands. The realization that he was facing Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation for deadly accuracy was legendary, had shaken his confidence badly. "Looking for someone, Marshal?" Sarah said quietly, pressing the muzzle of her Winchester against the back of his neck. Garrett froze, his hands still gripping his half-loaded rifle. "Easy now, girl. Let's talk about this reasonable-like." "The way you talked reasonably with my father before you poisoned him." Sarah's voice was steady, but Jake could hear the pain underneath. "The way you planned to talk reasonably with me before putting a bullet in my back." "You don't understand the bigger picture here," Garrett said desperately. "Your father's network was compromising federal operations, getting good men killed. I did what I had to do for the greater good." "No," Sarah replied. "You did what you had to do for revenge, because my father helped put your brother away, and you couldn't let that stand." Jake appeared beside them like a ghost, his Colt trained on the remaining deputy, who had been trying to flank Sarah's position. "It's over, Garrett. Your men are dead or wounded, and you're outnumbered. Time to face the music." Garrett made one last desperate play, spinning around with his rifle, but Sarah was ready for him. Her shot took him center mass, and he toppled backward into the cold ashes of his campfire, his eyes staring sightlessly at the stars above. In the sudden silence that followed, Sarah felt the weight of what she'd done settle on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She'd killed a man, a corrupt lawman, but still a representative of federal authority. There would be consequences for this night's work that would follow them for years to come. Jake seemed to understand her thoughts. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "You stood up for what was right, no matter the cost." As dawn broke over Devil's Canyon, Sarah and Jake made their way back to the hidden cave to retrieve their horses. The surviving deputy, wounded but alive, had been left with medical supplies and instructions to carry word back to Denver about what had really happened to Marshal Garrett's patrol. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as they prepared to ride out of the canyon. Jake looked at her with something like wonder in his grey eyes. "Now we disappear for a while. Let things settle down. Your father's network needs to be rebuilt, and there are still good people out there who need help starting over. Question is, are you ready to take on that kind of responsibility?" Sarah thought about her father's legacy, about the countless desperate souls who had found hope in his secret operation. She thought about the danger, the constant threat of pursuit, the likelihood that she would never again know the simple peace of running a general store in a quiet frontier town. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. As they rode out of Devil's Canyon toward an uncertain but hopeful future, Sarah McKinnon understood that she had inherited more than just her father's business. She had inherited his mission, and with Jake Morrison riding beside her, she finally felt capable of carrying it forward. The sun rose behind them, painting the sky gold and crimson, and Sarah knew that her real life was just beginning.